Okay, and I would first and foremost like to thank all four of you for agreeing to be here tonight. We know you're busy. We know you have a lot of demands on your time. You could have easily been in a committee meeting tonight, so thank you for making the time for this. We really appreciate it, and Jacob and I are delighted to be having this conversation. Okay, so I'm curious, before we get into policy, every legislature kind of has its own energy, its own vibe, depending on the personalities and so on and so forth. I would like to know, if you're willing to say, how often do either the four of you as a whole or any two of you get together to have conversations about what's going on with bills? Is that happening?
Yes. So I guess I'll go. I hope I don't just tell any secrets. No, but I think, Senator Sievers-Gansert and I have weekly meetings on the calendar just to make sure that we're at least touching base that often. But I feel like we find each other in our offices, in the hallway, and we're in committee every day together, so we talk quite often. And then I know Steve and I are similarly situated. We have weekly meetings, but we're in a lot of the same meetings and get to see each other on a daily basis. And KK and I are also on the same committee every day in finance. And then we have some weekly meetings with the four of us. And I think we're trying to keep those lines of communication open because that does make for better policy. It makes for a smoother session, and at least we can all know what's going on in the building. So I think we try to have good communication and definitely make an effort to schedule that time with each other so that, the days don't just fly by and all of a sudden it's been a while since you've spoken to anyone.
Does anyone have anything to add to that, or should we move on?
Well, I'll just say PK and I, Assemblyman O'Neill and I, can I call you PK?
You can call me anything you want.
I don't know who did the seating chart, but we sit next to each other when we have the joint hearing of Ways and Means and Senate Finance. We sit next to each other, and actually it's quite a pleasure. And we actually get a lot done sitting next to each other, either before or after committee, or we're waiting for folks to come up. So as much as people might want to think there's conflict, I think we all genuinely like each other.
Yeah.
And we probably talk more than I would say our predecessors, at least since I've been in the building. I think we talk a lot more than was typical. So.
Okay, and what about conversations with the governor? How often have each of you met with the governor since the session started?
So I can speak on our behalf. Our caucus, we talk to his administration, his representatives all the time, and all four of us meet at least every other week with him. And just to add to the other, I know Senator Canizar and I share a number of committees as well. So, and we are accessible to each other. So today I needed to stop by to ask her something and got right into her office. So I think that's important that we have these strong relationships and that we're open and accessible to each other.
Okay, so there's conversations going on. Glad to hear it. I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to let Jacob jump in. So I think we're all well aware, those of us who follow this session.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure who that is.
It's probably me. I always take the fall.
Whose fault is that?
I don't think it's me. Cycling.
Maybe it was you.
I can hear you.
Can you guys hear me now?
We can loan you one.
Is it a volume problem? Sorry, apologies for the sound issues.
I can't.
I can yell. I'm pretty good at projecting. I suppose I can just talk loudly for the moment.
It's on LCB.
I'm here if you need to switch my mic. So there are topics of the legislature that are controversial and many that are not. On the controversial topics, everyone is just so curious, including me. Is there room for compromise? This is what's in everyone's mind. So, for example, on election reform, which we all know can be a bit contentious, Speaker, I'll ask you first. Do you think there is room for compromise and negotiation at all with some kind of reform of our election system?
Well, I think Senator Canizar and I had a press conference right after the governor's State of the State, and I think the one thing we said we were not willing to compromise on was access to the ballot that we worked really hard to do in the state. My view on it is we have safe, fair, secure elections. The last 4 secretaries of state, one of whom is here in the audience, we've had 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And so for me, in my mind, I don't think there is compromise. We've done really hard work to expand access to the ballot, and we've seen that throughout the election cycle by how many people are voting and voting by mail. I was one of them. So, if there's some proposals that don't chip away at those core things, I think there's room to talk. But speaking for me and my caucus, and I think for Senator Cannizzaro and hers, that's something very sacred to us. So probably not a lot of room for compromise there.
Okay, appreciate your honesty on that. So now, forgive me, Jacob, I have to press on one particular issue. So polls, including a poll that we did at the Nevada Independent, are showing us that a majority of Nevadans actually support voter ID. And the Republicans, I believe, are proposing that voter ID be added into the mix in Nevada. Are you open to at least having a conversation about that, Speaker?
I think it's a solution in search of a problem. There's not a problem. We've got the safest, securest election. We're a model for the country. So, I would say no. I think we need more electeds, and I'm not for anyone here, but we need more electeds who will stand up and say, we're going to put country or state over party and stop with the talking points about stolen elections, about all this, when we know it's not true. So I just don't see a need to have that conversation because I don't see a problem.
Assemblyman O'Neill, I suspect you disagree. What do you have to say?
I always say I respectfully disagree. And I think some of it is semantics, though, in the conversation. If we went through the bill piece by piece, I think we would find some commonalities in it. But I do, and Speaker Yeager, he and I really do get along very well. Even if we do disagree, I can promise you later we'll be joking about this and jibing each other. But I think, as you said, you did a poll. People have no disagreement with some kind of voter ID bill. And so I think some of that is the description of what do you mean by ID. I think you need something more strong than just a signature on a ballot that's being read and determined by a machine or by fallible humans that it's legitimate or not. So I think we can find common ground. I think we should find common ground and deliver I disagree the one point on that we're a model for the nation. I felt in talking to some Democrats who are been elected, they actually went the other way. We were more of an embarrassment when it took weeks later to actually validate who was elected to a position. But that's probably a lot of how we just interpret and look at things a little differently.
Yeah, there was that. I mean, we all realize that not everyone on a national basis understands how elections work in individual states, including Nevada. So there was a lot of malcontent, I would say, with how long it took for us to come up with our results. Senator Severs-Gansert, do you think that we should perhaps dictate that even with early voting, let's say we keep mail ballots the same, let's say we change nothing else about the election law, but we decide that all ballots must be received by Election Day so they can be counted on election night? How do you see that?
I believe there's at least one or two bills out on that topic, and I've sat on the Legislative Operation and Elections Committee for quite a while, and we knew this was going to be delayed as far as the results because of the late postmark, because you didn't have to turn it into Election Day, and also because we have a system that is decentralized. So you have to have the different counties report up. So between mail, the late postmark, those things I think add to the perception that we don't have as strong of an election system or integrity as we should. And I don't think that's correct. I think we have safe and fair elections, but I do think that we need to be able to get the ballots on time so that we aren't the last ones in the nation to be able to announce our results.
Speaker, where do you stand on this?
It is a blessing that it takes a long time here because that means we're a purple state and we're a competitive state. We're a state that matters, right? We know other states' outcomes. It doesn't matter. They can stop counting on election night. So I see it as a blessing. And in terms of the postmark, I mean, either we're going to say that we have robust access to the ballot under the Constitution or not. So if we're going to allow mail-in voting, as long as that ballot is postmarked by Election Day, it should be counted. And when you look at the back end of that process, we're not talking about tens of thousands of ballots that are coming in by mail after Election Day. It's mostly people dropping off their ballots on Election Day. Those have to be processed, and it takes time because we want that process to be accurate. We want to be able to ferret out the ballots that don't match, And we do a good job of that. And we want voters to be able to come in and cure when they actually did sign that ballot, but there's some kind of glitch. So that all takes time. And so for me, that time reflects our commitment to allow access to the ballot and to be accurate. And how much of a blessing is it that in every one of these contests, whether it's statewide or in the country as a whole, we really do matter. Accuracy takes time, fairness takes time, and I think that's a blessing for the state.
So what I'm hearing is that there will not be much compromise on this topic at the legislature.
Always happy to talk about it, but I think, I think we just have a difference of opinion on that, right? And you have to draw that line somewhere, and I think for Senator Cannizzaro and I, we draw that line at Election Day. If it's postmarked or it's dropped off, it needs to be counted, but we have to do that in a way that maintains accuracy, fairness, and that takes time.
Okay.
I understand the counterpoint. I just disagree with it and think that this is a better approach for the state.
Okay, let's
You know,
move on
and
to...
I agree
Oh,
too.
yeah,
We
go
want to
ahead.
make sure people take time, but I also think the delay makes it difficult. And I just want to also add that we want to make sure everyone has access to the ballot. We want to make sure we get the turnout. So by no means do we ever want to reduce who can vote, but there's sort of the rules of engagement. We want to make sure that they're clean and they're fair and that we take the time. But given the postmark, it would be helpful and provide more positive perception, I think, of our elections. But we want to make sure everyone can vote and they have access.
Yeah, I think part of this conversation is always a little difficult because, there's a reality question, there's a perception question, and there is, how much credence do you give to each one when you're making policy decisions? All right, let's move on to education, and I think Jacob's got some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, as we know, there's a huge injection of money, right, set for the K-12 education system, $2 billion, massive increase to per pupil education funding. And the governor said that it's no longer an excuse that school districts in Nevada can say they're underfunded, right? Well, here's the funding, now show the performance. But he said that if there isn't performance increases by 2025, he wants to see systemic changes. But our question is 2 years enough time to even measure whether or not we've seen a good enough shift in performance based on this injection of funding? And I guess we'll start with the Democrats.
So first and foremost, this is a work in progress that has come from years of a very diligent and thoughtful analysis of how it is that we fund education in the state. We have implemented a new way of funding to ensure, because we've heard loud and clear from people in this state that if we're going to be voting for additional money for education, that money has to go to education in a meaningful way, not in a meeting that money comes into education and is somehow supplanting what would ordinarily go in so that we're not ever seeing meaningful increases, right? And so that is how I think you see the funding working, and that's where that $2 billion comes into play. We're seeing increased revenues in the state, and that money flows into education where it should be, where it has always intended to be, but in the past has been sort of, okay, well, we have extra revenue from these sources, so we're going to put fewer other sources into education. That's not how we should be funding education. And so for the first time, you are actually seeing that all of the money that has been designated for education is actually going to education and staying there, which I think is a huge piece of that, right? This is an outflow of increased revenue in the state and the design of how it is that we have made a very deliberate decision to fund education in Nevada. And so as a result, to your point, Jacob, we are going to see an increase in per pupil funding. And I know that the speaker and I have had a lot of conversations about this. What that means is that we need to know from these districts, how are you going to use this money? Because it does matter if we are putting those funds into education, because they go into programs like Read by 3. They go into programs to support our English language learners and our special education students, and to support teachers in the classroom and different programs that we have that we know have success for student achievement. And so with such a large influx of money, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we know how that money is being spent. And we're starting that process with hearings with each of the superintendents of the school districts that is designed to bring them in front of us and say, hey, we want to know how you're going to be spending this money. Some of that needs to go to teachers and to staff that are in our schools so that they feel supported. That money also has to go into programs that we know have those outcomes that we want to see with our students excelling. And so I think, while 2 years, I don't want to put a time frame on what exactly that means and what we see in 2 years, but I think it has to start with the point of saying to every school district, here's how you have this money coming to you. What are you going to do with it? What are your plans? So that we're being very thoughtful about it, very purposeful about that.
Speaker, look, I've been in this state for 25 years now, and there has been a constant drumbeat about accountability in education. And so I think most of us who have lived in the state for this long and have been frustrated with the education system can understand the desire to have accountability and to have it as quickly as possible. Is 2 years about right? Is that enough time to make the changes that the senator just got done kind of running down, like where the big challenges are in education? Because the governor keeps, he said more than once, 2 years is the number he has in mind. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I'll say, you talked about accountability in the past. We're talking about $2.25 billion more in education. I don't remember a time where we ever injected that kind of revenue. That's about $2,000 more per pupil. Still doesn't get us to the national average. We're still behind where we need to be, but that's a significant investment. To answer your question, are you going to turn the Titanic around in 2 years? Of course not. But what we need to see progress in 2 years. And I think what the senator was talking about, and I think what everybody's interested in, is getting those districts in front of us to say, all right, we're giving you a lot of money. What are you going to do with it? And how is it going to improve achievement, student achievement, and how are you going to retain teachers and professionals? We certainly can come back in 2 years and ask those same questions to look back, well, did you do the things you said you were going to do? Did we see improved outcomes? Are we going to turn this thing around in 2 years? Absolutely not. We're not going to turn around in 2 years. But 2 years of the same with no improvement is a problem. And so while I don't know exactly what Governor Lombardo referenced or what he meant by that, I can tell you all of us expect that accountability and that transparency. I heard that every single day at the doors. My constituents say, great, you're going to give more money to the problem, but how are we going to fix it? So I think the four of us want to say, you need to come before us and talk about that because, the superintendents don't have to come before the legislature. Every other state agency that asks for money comes before us and talks about, this is what we need, this is how we're going to spend it, we get a chance to ask questions. We do that with the Department of Education, but it's pass-through money. So this is our chance to bring the districts in and say, show us a vision and a plan for how you're going to improve education.
Well, I want to follow up on that because when you talk about the superintendents coming up before the legislature, I guess my question is, what's a satisfactory answer? I mean, what do you want to hear from them? And the converse, right? What do you not want to hear from them when they're coming in front of you? I guess we'll go to Senator Sievers-Gansert first.
Okay, so first of all, I think we all agree that we want to make sure we improve the outcomes. And reflecting back on the 2015 session where Read by 3 was implemented, and money for English language learners, and also the Victory School, so low income, the needle was moved. By 2019, our fourth graders were reading at the national average. That was the first time that ever happened for the state of Nevada. Again, 2019, 4 years later, our fourth graders were reading at the national average. I think we need to push on it. I think we need to have quantitative measurements. I don't think we just need to talk about it. They're going to come in and they're going to tell us the buckets of money and where they're going to put them. But I think what we need really is maybe even a dashboard that has some quantitative numbers where we can measure reading and we can measure mathematics and we can measure science. Something that hit me the other day when we had the superintendent of schools, Joan Ebert, in, she said right now 20% of our students are not on track to graduate from high school, right? So the issues are there. We've had some programs that have worked before. I'm expecting that some of the superintendents will come in with those types of programs, but those of you who've been on a money committee with me, I harp on the Read by 3. If you think about the trajectory of a child and how they can succeed, if they can read by 3, it's completely different than if they can't. So we need to really pay attention.
So I want to follow up on that. I'm glad you mentioned it because the governor mentioned it in his State of the State explicitly that he wants to put the teeth back in, essentially, to Read by 3. And what I mean by that, for those of you that don't know, is that the way the law was originally written is that if a student cannot read at proficiency by the end of third grade, they are held back. Because there are studies that show, this is just a fact, that if students can't read at grade level going into fourth grade, now we have a problem. And it's very hard for them to catch up, and it gets increasingly more difficult for them as the years go on. It was the Democrats who pushed to take out the requirement to hold back. Other requirements were left, I believe. Is there now, are you open-minded to perhaps bringing that aspect of the law back into it now that we've seen what has happened and how it did begin to work while it was in effect? Speaker.
Well, here's what I'll say. We have a historic number of educators that are serving in the Assembly. I think our entire Education Committee is comprised of educators, which is really great. And so, no, I say that because I'm not an educator, right? I mean, I'm a lawyer by trade. I haven't spent a lot of time in the classroom. It's not what I do day to day. Am I open to a discussion? Of course I am. But I'm going to rely on those education professionals in the committee to vet that policy and to tell me about how these things work in the real world. So I'm going to largely defer to them, but open to the conversation, of course, but would also defer to my Senate colleague who might have more detail to add to that point.
Can I get a yes or no?
Yes, of course, we're open to talking about it. And I think, one of the things that is important about this is that Read by 3 is a program that we know works, right? We do good things in education in Nevada. We have a lot of successes. And so if you're talking about accountability, it's how do you continue to replicate that and build on that? Because we do know things that do work.
Okay, Assemblyman, that was a lot of words, so I want to give you a chance to chime in. Go ahead.
Oh, I was falling asleep over here. I wondered when you...
Someone get this guy a Mountain Dew.
I am excited about the governor's program, his discussions he's had, and what he's going to present, I believe, on education. Read by 3 is important because it's the basis for everything else in what you're going to learn. If it's mathematics, you name it, it's going to be written, and you have to be able to write, read it, and understand it. So Read by 3 is important. It's maybe my background. I got to say, you're right. You can't turn the Titanic at all. It's sunk. But, and so forget it now. Let's just move on.
Save the deck chairs.
Yeah. But I do believe in 2 years, you can at least see some changes, some minor changes, even as the fifth largest school district in this country is Dan and Clark County. I believe in 2 years, you can start seeing some changes. And the governor's even, I think, I can't speak for the governor. So this is always just PK-isms. But I do believe in his statements, he has said, if there's good reasoning why that child cannot read by 3 and pass, we will allow him to continue on. But there has to be a plan to help them increase and improve in their system. And I come from a different background as everybody. I'm in law enforcement, and we have measurable and accountable missions. And we always used to say, you can hope for something, but hope without a plan is just a 4-letter word, and that's all it is. And the superintendents are coming in this Saturday, will be working with their plan. And I don't want to hear from one of them that they hope this will work. They have to have a plan because we've given them the tools to deal with it now. And they should be able to present their plans on what they're going to do to move that needle, even in the 2 years, because that's all we've got is 2 years, and then we're back.
Right.
And we have to work again at more improvements. So we need some kind of measurement, some goals to at least show that there are, and if there aren't, then why aren't they? And let's look at what we can do to improve that.
Okay,
we are
great.
striving every day to build the better mousetrap.
Sounds like we have some consensus on this topic. Look, we could talk about easily K-12 education the rest of the time, and it probably deserves it, but we need to move on to other topics. So higher education, I believe, is on deck.
That's right. So, I mean, with higher education, obviously Nevada's system controlled by the Board of Regents or governed by the Board of Regents, right? And I guess if we're talking about higher education, it just had its first hearing today. SJR 7 is another crack at a move that would take the regents out of the Constitution, right? In the past, the legislature has argued that it needs more control for accountability, right? For the regents and for higher education more generally. But the legislature already has the power of the purse. So I guess looking at SJR 7 and frankly looking at other legislation that's already cropped up, I mean, even just today, that would change the way that higher education functions in Nevada. What's the legislature looking for? What does more accountability for higher ed mean in this context? And I guess we'll start with you, Speaker.
Always starting with me. Okay.
I noticed that. Thank you very much. I'll give you the $5 later.
Well, no, I mean, I think we did obviously give to the voters some time ago, changing the governance structure that failed very narrowly. And to be quite candid, I think it was a very confusing ballot question. So I think that's why you're seeing another crack at that. And that's something that's got to be changed by the voters. So I'm supportive of that effort because the voters should have their say. But, I think much like K through 12 education, right, we're looking for outcomes in higher education, right? And particularly in this state, with the workforce issues we have, we are looking, I think all of us, to better align what the curriculum is in higher education to the actual jobs that we need to fill here in the state, and not just the jobs that we have now, but the jobs that we're going to have 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And I'll just say, that's not really just a higher education conversation, that's an entire education system conversation, because I think too long we've sort of viewed those as two very distinct and separate systems, but they should be working together. So, I think we'll look at that, and obviously we made a lot of cuts during the last session to higher education, a lot of cuts to a lot of things because of COVID. Obviously, we're in a much better financial situation as a state. So I think we'll be looking to restore some of those cuts and think about where can we spend the money to get the most bang for our buck.
Okay.
Any follow-up?
Well, I think I don't want to spend too much time on higher ed because you have so much to get to.
We do. We
So
certainly do. I'm
we
happy
may
to
as
move
well-
on unless you have a
I'm happy
follow-up.
to
Okay,
pick
great.
up back to
Hard questions have to go to Assemblyman O'Neill.
All right, let's talk about affordable housing, which is an issue, I think, statewide. I can easily say the reasons for it may be a little different in each county, but nonetheless, there's definitely a problem with it. And that's both whether we're talking about rents or the cost of home. So some affordable housing bills that died last session included bills to ramp up some tenant protections. There was a move to end the summary eviction process. And some critics say, so I guess I'm going to start with a politics question and then we'll move to policy, that some of that was a product of the realtors' heavy campaigning and lobbying against those things. If many of you know that the Nevada Independent has been publishing what we call our Follow the Money series, where we tell you who's giving how much to which lawmakers, and by who I mean lobbyists and advocacy groups. And the Realtors Association is one of the biggest donors to lawmakers across the board. They obviously care deeply about real estate policy in the state. But I've heard, there's word that perhaps they have an undue influence, and then maybe some of those bills died because of that. Senator Cedars-Gansert, I'm interested to hear what you might have to say about this.
Okay, so we've had a number of bills that have come through the committees over the years, and I think we all agree that we need to have attainable housing. Some individuals are switching from affordable to attainable, so what can you afford to do? But something that the former governor did do was to put the $500 million in the Home Means Nevada to be able to leverage that to create more housing. And when I looked at that, I did quite a bit of analysis on that $500 million and how it would be leveraged and if it would work. And in talking to some of the developers in Reno, it made sense. And so that's something I think that had a lot of bipartisan support at the affordable housing level. When you look at some of the legislation that comes through, that's landlord-tenant, I think there's a lot of nuances. And I'm not someone who's been in that business, but I know when we look at things like rent control, typically people don't invest in their properties if they have a cap on how much they can charge for rent. And so we have to be really cautious about policies like that because we want to make sure that people do invest in properties and people continue to expand properties so that we have more housing. So a big piece of this is the supply side.
Okay, so I must point out that you didn't answer my question, but I'm very interested in what you just said, so I'm going to stick with that for a second. And I really would like to know what each of you think, because there was a move in North Las Vegas last year to enact rent control. It didn't pass, but it didn't do as badly maybe as some might have thought it would. What I want to hear from each of you is, when we talk about rent control, if we talk about rent control or anything of its ilk, do you think that it should be statewide, across the board, or should we let the local jurisdictions decide what to do about that in their own neighborhoods? So that's the question. And I'll let you go first since you raised the topic.
So I think rent control will dampen the supply side. We need individuals to create more housing, to build more housing, and we also want to make sure that those who have housing keep the houses and the apartments and so forth maintained. So I think that would be a threat to having good housing. And again, the supply side, I think we need to make sure that local governments can streamline their processes, that there's land available, and then using the state and federal dollars to be able to leverage to build things at a lower cost to make those housing entities or those units more affordable.
Okay. Asseliman, do you agree with her? Do you agree with what you just said?
Well, your question is, do I want rent control decided by the state or at the local level, correct?
So I tried to expand it a little bit, like any type of policy that would have to, rent control or anything of its ilk where the law, right, a city or a county or a state is getting involved in how much people can charge for rent and trying to generally control it. Are you completely against it across the board, as Senator Sievers-Gansert is?
I believe the best government that we have is the closest to the people. And Nevada is diverse, so diverse that I really don't like voting on things that only affect Clark County. I do not like pop caps. Some of these, in the same time, I'll say that those from Clark County should be respectful when we up north need a bill passed that's really only unique to us. So, yeah, I'm opposed to the state delivering or ordering rent control because there is such diversity in there. Let the locals handle it. We've given them the authority. But if you really want to talk about affordable housing or attainable housing, I've often asked everybody to explain to me why someone can say that this little home is affordable housing when it's $450,000 and it looks like a dollhouse. We've got to get property back to allow the cities to expand, to allow the developers to have land to build homes on. It's strictly supply and demand. I know it sounds simplistic to a very complicated issue. We've made it complicated. I also subscribe to the KISS theory of keep it simple, stupid. And that's it. We need the land so the developers can have a build on it. Then we need the labor force. The cost of what it costs of the equipment to build that is all factored in, and that's driven by the economics of it all.
All right, let's circle back because I want to hear from the Democrats. So on this
No, you
topic,
don't. You want to hear from us.
yes, I certainly do. So on the topic of rent control, so it's my question's really pretty simple. I guess I'll turn it into a three-part question now. So do you support any form of rent control as a general policy? And if you do, should it be a state policy or should it be, as Assemblyman O'Neill suggests, and it should be handled on a local level?
So I think if you go out and talk to Nevadans, and I think you sort of made this point, right, across the board, the issue of being able to afford housing and being able to keep up with rent, especially where we're seeing increases, and this is not true of every place that you live, but there are some folks who, have a place to live where all of a sudden they're getting $500, $800, $1,000 increases year over year. I don't know of a working family that can absorb that type of cost. So I think we have to have a discussion about what does it mean to be able to increase rent and how are you pricing folks out of their homes that they live in, that they've been good tenants of, that they have paid their rent on time, when you're asking them to pay very high amounts. What that looks like, I think we have to have a discussion about, and how it's implemented, be that state or local. I think there's a very valid conversation to have that maybe local governments should be able to take a look at that, right? Because they do know that community a little better. Maybe they have a better pulse of, what might work better in a particular place or what sort of restrictions could exist. I don't know that I have made up my mind, or us at the legislature in my caucus have made an ultimate decision on those conversations, but I think it has to be had because, again, if you go and talk to Nevadans, it is top of mind for them.
Absolutely.
You would be hard pressed. I've knocked a lot of doors in my time, and this last election was no different, and it didn't matter where you were in the Las Vegas Valley, you were hearing that.
Yep.
And we have an obligation to take that concern and to vet it at the body that we serve in.
All right, Speaker, where do you stand on this?
I'm going to answer that question, but I do want to address something you said in the first part of your question, and that was about the realtors and the real estate industry.
Thank you.
Having undue influence. I will tell you there are a lot of very competent lobbyists in the building, many of whom are in this room. We get lobbied all the time on things, and I don't think they have undue influence, but I think we obviously respect their voice because they're in the industry, whether it's the realtors, the apartment association, or the flip side, the housing coalition. And I think just to get back to last session, I think what we really tried to do last session is to say, look, we're coming out of the pandemic. We don't yet know what the future of this state's going to be. And we really ended up focusing on one piece of legislation, Assembly Bill 486, that basically took the rental assistance money, prevented folks from being evicted while that application was pending. So I think you saw other things fall away because we had that money from the federal government. Now it's a new session, and you're seeing some of those bills that failed last session reemerge this session. And I think you're going to see them start to move and get hearings. But to answer your question, I certainly am in favor of rent control or rent stabilization, rent caps, whatever you want to call it, for our seniors and vulnerable populations in the state. I mean, they don't have more money. They're on fixed incomes, and they cannot withstand those kind of increases. And I think as a statewide policy, that is something we ought to look at. The second part of the question is a little bit more nuanced. I don't know if I think rent cap is wise beyond that. Honestly, we would need to have that hearing and hear from the folks, because they've tried it in Minneapolis. Minneapolis and St. Paul have different processes right across the river with vastly different outcomes. So I would want to hear more about that. I tend to think if we're going to do something like that, local is better because every community is different. But certainly I could be convinced otherwise, and so I look forward to having that discussion about what the right policy for Nevada might be.
Okay, thanks for that.
Well, I did want to follow up really quick
Sure.
on the housing portion of this, because certainly when we talk about supply side, so, developing in Nevada is a fun business, right? Because, talk about developing in Las Vegas, so much of it is determined from, is the federal government going to sell this land to Clark County, right? Or if you're talking about Reno, right, where are you going to build? It's a mountain or it's filled. So you're talking about infill. Okay, well, now we're talking about NIMBYs. So it's a complicated question, solving the supply side piece. So I guess my question is, what's the legislature's responsibility in making sure that these questions get solved, right? Is it money? Is it subsidies? I mean, what's happening on the legislative side to fix the supply issues? And I guess so the Republicans brought it up, so I'll kick it to them first.
I'll just point, there's a bill out there from Assemblywoman Howdegui on housing. It's a very large bill. We've had a lot of conversation about it, but it addresses some of what you're talking about. Zoning, processes, speeding up the process. But so I think the legislature clearly has a say in those sort of issues, right? I mean, we need more supply. And as you said, that's going to require us to build up, and it's also going to require us to help finance some of these affordable projects. I think you saw that through IFC with the Home Means Nevada Fund. But I think policy-wise, we're going to have that discussion, and I would recommend to everybody, many of you in the room already know about this bill. It's getting a lot of interest on all sort of sides of the issue, from developers to local governments. But what it's trying to do is find those sticking points in the process and try to remove those. That's always difficult, right? Because one, we just like things the way that they are, right? And nobody wants the projects in their backyard. But the truth is that we're going to solve this problem. We're landlocked. We have to do those kind of solutions. So I think you're going to see both policy and money as well in terms of funding. Either it's more rental assistance or pitching in the money for affordable housing to make those projects pencil out.
Okay, well, I guess you're on the Assembly side, right? Assemblyman O'Neill, I mean, what's your reaction to this kind of push from the Democrats, right, to make these changes?
I want to hear more. I'll just put it that way.
Do you agree with what the speaker said, that the legislature's best role when it comes to the supply side question is speeding the process, and smoothing the way and getting out of the way?
Let me give you an example. Story County. Look at the growth they've had out at Tahoe Regional Industrial Park out there. How did they do that? They expedited, they looked at what are the limitations, why aren't we getting our building permits, our controls out faster, quicker. Even the governor's just asked, one of his first executive orders is, every agency, give me 10 regulations that are inhibiting growth of businesses in this state, and let's start removing them so this state can expand and grow. Story County, to me, is one of the best examples versus other. We have a long, demanding process, almost a ridiculous process at times in some areas, on building codes alone, and re-examining them, and then going over it again. So we really need, and that's where the locals should have that control to what can they do if they really want the growth and they want to address housing, however, whether it's multifamily, single family, stick home, vertical, horizontal, whatever, they should have that freedom to do it. And yeah, we should be there to facilitate and help them, but we should not be the controlling and overarching dictator to what the locals have. It's their responsibilities, to me, to address their local issues the
Okay,
best.
I'm going to pivot. We're going to switch to a new topic here in a second, but this is completely unrelated to what we just got done talking about, but I'm so curious about this. So recently it was suggested, there's a proposal at hand that prison inmates who have served their time and been released should not be, by law, required to submit to a background check in order to rent an apartment. And I think it seems as if it's controversial. I've seen a lot of very passionate opinions on both sides. So I'll recap it for the audience to make the conversation up here a little more simple. So on one side is the argument that folks who have been released from prison, they've served their time, they paid their price, they want to start over, they want to start a new life. If a landlord runs a background check and discovers they've been in prison and denies them on that basis, then it denies them the opportunity to move forward with their lives. The flip side of the argument is that landlords should have a right to know who's renting from them and should have every right to run a background check and see who they're dealing with. So if you can, just tell, if you have an opinion, if you formed one at this point, just tell me where you stand on the issue. And I will start with...
Politicians, who wouldn't have an opinion?
Well, an
That's
opinion
what
they're
you're
willing to
famous
state
for.
out loud right here tonight is perhaps another matter. So Assemblyman, since you seem to have an opinion, what is it?
Let me turn to my attorney.
I don't think she's gonna help you on this one.
I agree that you said it. I do believe it's my property. I own. They should have a right to know. Let's just say I have a multifamily home, duplex or quadplex, with children living in it. And here's a person, he comes to me, yeah, I'm just out, but I do the background check and he's in there for child pornography. Do I want to rent to him? Here, my other 3 tenants have children. Do you really want them? I wouldn't do it. Or they went to, you don't have to go to jail. You could sometimes just get parole, probation right off the bat. Mm-hmm. But they were doing labs. They were cooking meth and blew the last place up. That's how. Do I want to rent to them? Not really. It's going to be a very high, what do they call it, casualty or repair damage fee for. So yeah, I think, and it's his property, her property. They have a right to know how their property is being used and who's using it.
Okay, I want to move forward. So I'm just one or the other of you. Let's go with the speaker. Can you give me a quick answer?
Yeah, he always disagrees.
Well, I'll
Yeah.
say,
anyways.
Assemblyman O'Neill, if it's a sex offender, they're on lifetime supervision. The probation officer has to get involved. So, that example, I don't think is a good one. They're not going to be living next to kids in any case. But here's what I'll say. I don't have an opinion on it, but I want to just say, here's how I would look at that issue. You just talked about the supply. Well, if someone doesn't have a place to live, that's a problem, right? And if we say we believe in trying to rehabilitate ex-offenders, that starts with housing. That's crucial. But I see the other side of it, right? If I'm a landlord, I think I should be able to do a background check. And if that person has a violent history or they've been involved in manufacturing drugs, I think they should have the right to not rent to that person. So I guess I'll say without having the hearing, I feel it's a little bit more nuanced, but that's what makes our job hard. It's not black or white. We have 2 competing objectives, both of which are worthy, and that's why we have to try to figure out when we get to committee hearings. So I think I could likely support something like that if it had exceptions for low-level offenders, because we've got to be able to house them, or they're going to be back in the system, or they're going to be victimizing the community, and none of us should want that.
Okay. And I think we had one more criminal justice question, actually, so we can, I didn't really mean for that to be a segue, but it seems to work. So,
It is a perfect
So go
segue,
ahead.
Yeah, because I did want to ask about AB 236 from 2019.
Here it
right?
comes.
There it is.
We've all been waiting for it.
Right, well, so the governor, on the campaign trail says it's the Democrats are soft on crime, and it caused the crime increases that we saw in the sort of post-pandemic period, in the years after 2019, certainly, right? And so I guess just at a base level, was it responsible for more crime? And if so, or if not, why not, or why?
No, absolutely not. Actually, since the enaction of the bill, violent crime in Nevada is down 7%, and population adjusted is down 14%. A couple things we got to remember, and I'm going to be as brief as I can here, but just to kind of bring us back to AB 236. AB 236 was a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill. Governor Sandoval was in office, and he looked at the budget, and he said, we're going to have to spend upwards of $1 billion on new prisons if we don't get our prison population under control. He invited national experts to come in and help us in Nevada do a couple of things. One, identify the violent people, the people we're afraid of, the people that are victimizing our communities, and make sure that they are in prison, and they are in prison for a long time. And to separate from that, the nonviolent, lower-level offenders who are unnecessarily spending time in prison, to say, can we treat them in the community? Can we reform the problem? Because this is a Department of Corrections. Can we correct the problem? That was a 3-year process that we went through for that bill. So this idea that somehow it was like sprung on the legislature in the dark of night, not true. It was 3 years of work. And I'll tell you, when we got to that bill hearing, and I'll fast forward to the end, right? When we got to the Senate Judiciary Committee bill hearing, that was the last stop for the bill. It was the waning days of the 2019 legislative session. Not one entity, not one group testified in opposition to that bill. We had support from the Vegas Chamber, the Reno Sparks Chamber, the Retail Association of Nevada, the Truckers Association, Americans for Prosperity. These are not democratically leaning groups. They supported the bill. Metro was neutral on the bill. I had conversations with then Governor Lombardo. They were opposed to the bill. We made changes to the bill to address their concerns, including having the effective date be October of 2020, which if you guys remember October of 2020, we were in the midst of the pandemic. So the bill didn't even go into effect until the pandemic started. But that last hearing, we got bipartisan support out of the Senate. Democrats and Republicans alike voted for that bill. And when it came back to the Assembly to concur in that amendment, we got bipartisan support as well. So I would say every single reform you see in that bill, evidence-based. And I understand that on the campaign trail, we sometimes say things, but I have yet to see anybody bring any credible evidence to me that what we did in that bill increased crime in this state. The number one thing they point to is, well, thefts are up and people are getting away with thefts. Well, let me tell you, if you steal anything in this state, it's a misdemeanor. You are subject to a penalty of 6 months in jail. I don't know how many of you have been to jail, hopefully none of you, but 6 months in jail is not something to take lightly. So this implication that somehow there aren't consequences to crime is just not true. If we don't like the way that crimes are being prosecuted, then we ought to talk to our prosecutors who are elected about the way those cases are being handled. But this bill was designed to make us safer and to save taxpayer money, and I think it's achieved both of those things. That being said, we know the governor's bringing forth the bill at some point, always willing to have discussions about what the rationale is for those potential changes, and I think we'll work through that. But I'm extraordinarily proud of that bill, and I think it's worked. And by the way, we're one of the very few Democratic-led states in the country that has done comprehensive criminal justice reform. Most of this has come from Republican states, largely driven by Donald Trump when he was president.
Senator Seavers-Ganser, the speaker just alluded to the things that people say on the campaign trail that may or may not be true. Governor Lombardo, who is the former sheriff of Clark County, said on the campaign trail that that bill directly led to more crime in Nevada. Do you agree with him?
I believe in looking at the legislation that we've learned some things from it. There's some nuances around technical violations of probation that, so if you've offended a senior or if you had a sexual offense, some of those individuals do not have the consequences they had before. So I think there's definitely some refinements that need to be done to that bill. I think there was some good work done, but I think there are some nuances that did not turn out the way people thought they would turn out. So we've got people who are free and clear who probably should be back in jail or back in prison because of the way the bill was written as far as some of the technical violations. And I know when you're talking about misdemeanors and felonies for theft, I think the threshold went down or went up to $1,250, and I know law enforcement is interested in moving that back to like $750, and I can't remember if fentanyl was in there or not. Was that a separate bill or was that in fentanyl? Or was that in that bill? I thought it was. So, so it may have been in there, but I think we all are in agreement that we need to address the fentanyl crisis. And I think it was that bill, but it may not have been because that was the major bill. Right now, it's at the level for prosecution is 100 grams. 100 grams. 2 milligrams, 2 grains of salt is what's lethal. We completely missed the mark on that. I know the majority leader has a bill on fentanyl. I've got a bill on fentanyl. The Attorney General has a bill on fentanyl. And their bills are moving it down to 4 grams. 4 grams. Mine's 4 milligrams. So I'm down to no tolerance. That's the lethal level. Let's make sure we can prosecute it. And I believe it was in that bill. So there's some things that we need to change, I think, that were in the original bill Some of them are nuanced, but I can tell you the fentanyl piece is the most obvious, that we need to deal with this crisis. We need to make some changes and really lower the level so we have a zero tolerance policy here in Nevada for fentanyl.
And can I just
Yeah.
have to correct really quickly.
Sure.
Possession of any amount of fentanyl is a crime. It's a Schedule I controlled substance. I think what the senator is talking about is what type of crime is it.
right.
But I didn't want to give the impression that
Trafficking.
somehow it was legal. Like,
Sure.
if you have any controlled substance, it is a crime in this state.
Yes, we're
But
not
it's
saying that.
about trafficking, right? So trafficking is at a
Right.
very high level, and we really need to bring it down to where we have zero tolerance because it just kills people. We had over 500 people die of opioid overdoses last year, and over half of them were laced with fentanyl.
All right, let's
Well, and
quickly.
I was going to add to that too, because I think what the speaker said is correct. It is still a crime, but you also have to remember that fentanyl and the way in which it is regulated under a different schedule and is appearing in our neighborhoods and on our streets in a different fashion. And so part of what my fentanyl bill does is to address that, because that was not the purpose of Assembly Bill 236. That's
Right.
not what it did. It is still a crime. But the way in which fentanyl is typically and has been encountered in our statutes deals with medical grade fentanyl. It's not dealing with what we're seeing on the streets. And I think I take issue with the idea that Democrats are just soft on crime. I mean, I spent over a decade in law enforcement as a prosecutor in Clark County, in the biggest county in the state, prosecuting gang crimes and violent crimes. So that's something that I think I definitely understand. And we have seen bills to address where you have violent offenders, where you have sex offenders, where you have people who are dealing drugs, and you are seeing those bills. I have a fentanyl bill, as Senator Severs-Gansert mentioned. I also have a bill that's going to crack down on gun traffickers, where we see that very prevalent in some of our cases, and we have an obligation to take that very seriously and to address that. And so, just because we have passed smart criminal justice reform that makes sense and that is evidence-based doesn't mean that it is soft on crime, especially when you look at legislation as a whole, because I think there is a lot out there, and people, even in the Democratic Party and in our Democratic legislators, who are taking that very seriously and are willing to hold those folks accountable for those crimes.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's move on to tax policy.
Tax policy. Well, tax adjacent.
And
I guess.
related, tax adjacent issues.
Tax and miscellaneous. Because I want to start with the lottery, right? Because look, the lottery is such a big deal. You look at the line out of Prim, out in Verdi, people want to buy those lottery tickets. Nevada doesn't have a lottery, right? Because it's still unconstitutional. So I guess just at a base level, should Nevada have a lottery?
Well, given that the bill is originating in the Assembly with Assemblyman C.H. Miller, I think it is time. The constitutional prohibition was put there in 1864. We didn't even have gaming in the state. It'd be a long time. And when you look at the history of that, it's interesting. We'll get into that at the hearing. But I think it's time for us to have a lottery. The fact that all these folks from Vegas are driving to Arizona, driving to California for how many multi-billion-dollar jackpots did we have in the last 2 years? Why are we funding California and Arizona education when we could keep that money here? So I think there is a responsible way to do it. And that's why we're starting the process, and we're serious about that effort. It takes 2 sessions and a vote of the people. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's high time that we do it.
Okay, in the interest of speeding things along, does anyone disagree with anything the speaker just said?
Anything.
Anything? Wow, that's a big one.
Knock yourself out.
You're not in favor of a lottery?
No, ma'am, I'm not.
Why?
You just said time. I said no. Ready to move on to the next one.
Tell me no quickly.
Pardon?
Tell me why quickly.
I really
Why?
didn't-
Why are you against it?
Oh, it's in the Constitution.
What's the biggest reason that you think it's a bad idea?
The story that it's going to go to mental health, it'll be 6 years. I'll be nuts by then. And nuttier than I am today.
We'll be able to help
by
you.
then. And I'll need that. But 6 years is going to be too late.
The voters deserve to weigh in on it, and they haven't had the chance since the Constitution was passed. Let's give them that chance.
Yeah.
So we all know gaming is against this. Senator Severs-Gansert, should they be against it? Do they have reason to worry, or are they being unduly paranoid?
I haven't finished.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
No, I'm never done.
Go on.
We do this every day. That's why floor is late half the time.
And why we're going to be late tonight, I guess.
No, I'm against, the odds of winning, and it deals on people's, it's really most of the people that are spending those $10, $20, $100 or something to think that they're going to win $500 million or more are people that really can't afford it. Our odds, your odds are better going down to where you name the casino and putting it into one of the slots putting it on the table games, playing some of the games. You've got better odds on winning there and using the money that way than driving down, standing in line, and with a national lottery. That's why California had to join the national, because it wasn't delivering the money that they said it would for their educational system. So they had to go in a combine with other states. I don't see where it's really made a difference to California education across the line, or Arizona or anybody. I don't see the need for the lottery. It's years out. We've got a great gaming system here. This is where I will say we do have the gold standard in gambling. Everybody else wants to emulate us, and they have. They have done that. They use us as the example. Why change? But I will agree, though, minorly. I do respect the vote of the people, but I think I'll listen to the arguments on it. Honestly, I will. But as it stands now, I will be a strong no in opposition to it for those reasons.
Okay.
I don't see the need. I don't see where the value it's going to give us something 6 years from now, and it hasn't delivered to the other states what they said it would and suckered people into doing it.
Okay, Senator, quickly, any words on this?
You mentioned gaming. I think gaming's very concerned because they've invested so much in bricks and mortar in the state, and so they don't want anything to take away. And let's face it, gaming drives a big part of our economy. The second highest revenues are from gaming, and so I think we need to listen to what they're saying. But, of course, we'll all respect the vote of the people. Since it's a resolution, it will be passed to the Secretary of State, not the governor. Most likely, eventually, it'll end up on the ballot in 26.
Okay.
26?
Let's talk property taxes.
Yeah, property taxes, right? Well, I guess here's a simple question, right? Is it time for the state to reassess property tax caps? And whoever wants to jump on that one.
I'll take that one because I believe I'm the only one who voted for the property tax caps back in 2005.
Yes, tell us.
And yes, I will tell you.
The speaker remembers that well.
Shed light on that. At that time, housing was going through the roof. Housing prices were going through the roof like we're experiencing right now. And we just had a whole conversation about affordable housing, attainable housing. Well, when you start talking about seniors in particular, who were brought up as one group of people, one interest group, you can get taxed out of your home. So the bill that's on the table right now, instead of having a cap of 3% per year, it's a minimum of 3% per year. And if you start doing the math on 3%, over and over and over, you literally could tax people out of their homes. It will make your own property more expensive. It will make rental properties more expensive. So I don't think we should take the caps off. And I know I will vote against it because I saw what happened during the recession, or not the recession, the boom in the early around 2006, 2007. We just experienced that again. That's one of the reasons we are having a hard time with housing right now. So that would just even add more pressures to the market. And I think we just can't take the caps off. And we definitely can't make a 3% minimum.
Well, sticking on the Senate side, Majority Leader, any reaction to that?
I think one of the hardest parts about this is that we know that we owe the people of Nevada, right, a robust discussion about how it is that we fund government. And so there have been some conversations that we've had over the years with respect to property taxes and what that system looks like. I think one of the bigger concerns is right now we know that people are having a hard time affording the houses that they live in, affording to buy a house, keeping the places that they have. If they rent a place, someone owns that, right? And increases in things like property taxes have a real effect on families. So I don't know that now is the time that we should be talking about how do we raise property taxes. That's really hard for everyday Nevadans. And so is there part of that discussion that we can talk about how it is that we fund government? Absolutely. But I think going down a path of saying to Nevadans, hey, we want to raise property taxes, your house is going to be more expensive, is a very difficult one and something that we need to be aware of.
So on a topic that you just raised, which is the general tax portfolio in Nevada and how we bring our money into the state, one of the issues for us forever has been volatility, because a major part of our tax revenue bucket is sales taxes. And of course, sales taxes go up and down drastically depending on how the economy is doing, how inflation is doing, and so on and so forth. What is the one best way in your mind, and I want an answer from each of you, what is the one best way in your mind, so setting aside sales taxes, let's just say we didn't touch sales taxes, just left it alone the way it is. What other one thing should we do with the state's tax portfolio to help offset the volatility that is just sort of naturally created by this boom and bust cycle that happens? What's the one thing?
Who wants to start?
The best
three
thing.
wanna
What's
jump
the
in.
best thing?
Ladies first.
Well, I'll have to tell you, we have a robust rainy day fund that we put into place specifically so that we can make it through boom and bust times. And right now we have over $900 million. The governor's proposed another 10%, which eventually would grow to about $1.7 billion by 2025. And I think what we need to do, whenever we have the tax discussion, everyone points to somebody else that they need to pay taxes. And you know, again, considering the families in Nevada and how difficult it is right now because of inflation, because of housing costs, I don't think we should be raising any taxes. I think we need to make sure that we fill the rainy day fund, potentially expand the rainy day fund, and use a tool like that versus always looking to new taxes. I think we need to spend our money wisely, and we need to consider the budgets of the families of Nevada, and they can't afford anything else.
So I'm glad you mentioned the rainy day fund, and so now I'm going to piggyback a question onto my question, and so now you'll have two questions to answer. So which tax should we, add or raise to offset the problem that I mentioned earlier? But number two, when the conversation started about the rainy day fund, most of the Democrats, as far as I'm aware, kind of objected to it, said there's enough in the rainy day fund. We need money for other things. We're not on board with growing it to $1.7 billion. So you're not on board with the rainy day fund, correct? Either of you, Speaker and Senator Cannizzaro?
Well, I think that there's
You're not on board with increasing it above, let's say, $1 billion?
Well, I think that there is some nuance there because I do think that we should put money into the rainy day fund. That is what it is there for. And I think putting additional money into the rainy day fund over and above what the cap is now is something that we absolutely should look at.
Okay.
But should we take $1 billion and put it into the rainy day fund when we know we have needs in the state? That, I think, is something that would do a great disservice to Nevadans, especially when we're having conversations like today. We had a meeting in Senate Finance and Assembly Ways and Means where we were talking about, our youth in the state and youth mental health and how we're trying to fund some of these programs. And how are we providing the support for those families who are in crisis, victims of crime? How do we support that as a program? When you have needs in the state and you're talking about, well, let's squirrel away over $1 billion, and you're just going to ignore the fact that there are Nevadans that need access to services. There are programs that we need to invest in. When we're not investing in Nevadans, but we're going to go save that much money, I don't think that is fiscally responsible. And especially because...
Do you mind if I... Okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
and I think especially because, and I'll make one other point on that, once you get above a certain amount in the rainy day fund, the state is not benefiting from an increased financial position. We are not going to be it's not going to increase some kind of rating. It's not going to make the state more financially sustainable just because there's more money in the rainy day fund, especially when you ignore those services. And so for those reasons, I would say that, we support putting more money in the rainy day fund, but not an exorbitant amount that ignores what the issues are that we do have to address.
So, Speaker, I want to push you on this topic a little bit because you mentioned earlier the drastic cuts that have had to be made in the past, specifically to higher education. But we all know there have been many more cuts. Hundreds of millions of dollars of cuts have had to happen sometimes in one session. Is the senator right about this? Or, is there a middle ground? Because look, the Democrats are usually looking to fully fund, right, state services and state government. But if you're forced into a situation where every time there's a downturn, you have to cut and undo all the work you did, then obviously that's not sustaining effective policy over time. So where do you stand on this with the rainy day fund? What's the right number to be in that fund?
All assembly bills go to the Senate, so the senator is right. I think you have to, is it raining right now for certain Nevadans? And it is. It's raining now. I can tell you no one at a single door I knocked on said, we think you should put more money in a rainy day fund. They talked about youth mental health, they talked about education, talked about healthcare, state and worker employees. So here's what I'll say. Right now, with the injection of money that was put in the rainy day fund, we are number 11 in the country in terms of per capita rainy day fund. That's pretty good for Nevada, almost in the top 10. And we've already hit the cap that we set as a legislature for the rainy day fund. In addition, we have an education rainy day fund. It's called the stabilization account, but it's one of the things we did with the pupil-centered funding formula. I think we could look at potentially increasing that a little bit, but I think we have real needs in this state right now. And I don't know how I would go back to a constituency and say, hey, we had $1 billion extra, but instead of solving all the problems, that are impacting your life right now, we put it away in a savings account, so it'll be there in the future. Of course we have to be responsible, but we have 2.5 to 3 times more money than we've ever had in a rainy day fund. And yes, COVID was the rainiest of days, and I pray that we never end up in that circumstance again, but I think we have to be responsible to say, let's actually fund a state to a level that our constituents want and demand. We've never done that as a state, and we have a chance to do it now.
Right, so circling back to the tax bucket question.
Yes, what we should do is not reduce the threshold on the commerce tax. The largest businesses should continue to pay what was enacted in the commerce tax in 2015, and I think this idea that somehow we would give the largest corporations in the state a tax break, to me, that's the wrong approach, and that will actually keep a lot of money in our state general fund instead of having it go back basically for tax cuts for the biggest corporations in the state.
Okay. Assemblyman?
The rainy day fund and the stabilization, I really do agree, because you're right. It's ridiculous when we've had the downturns that we've had to make cuts, and then you come back when the economy's coming back to regain, to claw back what you just cut. So you're really never making any forward progress. That ship is sinking like the Titanic. Instead of being turned or moving forward, it's not happening. The governor has given us a budget, and we're looking at it. We are meeting the demands. There are areas, look at our state employees right now. We are short in every area, and we've heard it. People could just come in every time an agency come in and say ditto about their state employee needs. We're not meeting the mission of providing the services, whatever the department is, to our constituents out there. But even with that, so we need to address that, and we are doing it. We still have money left over to put into savings. And maybe I just came from my upbringing was you could never have enough money in savings because there will be unexpected expenses that you will have to meet. So I believe in it. It does help with our bonding and financial outlooks. We're meeting our needs. What is the needs? That's determined through the hearings and what we see. Well, we need to address some of these issues, but we're doing it. Right now, we have the money. We have the money to meet our needs, to meet the constituents' needs, and also put additional funds into our savings.
So the
on the economy?
So the 1.7 billion number you support?
Yes.
Okay.
On the economy, diversify, which is what the governor is trying to do right now.
Put that on hold because we're going to get to that topic.
I'm sorry. I
No,
thought
that's
that
okay.
was part of what he said.
Understood. We're going to get to that topic in depth, though, so hold that thought. But on the subject of families saving money, one of the reasons they can't is the cost of childcare.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, like, if you look at the state's budget, right, certainly federal money has played a huge piece in the last couple of years. And that includes childcare, right, where so much of it has been subsidized by the American Rescue Plan, certainly into the next couple of years. But what's the long-term solution for Nevada? Because the state can't rely on these one-time monies forever. So what happens next on childcare specifically?
Asking me?
Well, I think if the majority leader wants to jump in.
You should handle that one.
I mean, look, I think that is a very effective use of the money. And I think I'm speaking as a parent to a 1.5-year-old who is currently in daycare and as a soon-to-be parent for a little baby joining us very shortly. Childcare is a huge issue, but it's not just the cost of childcare. It is also the amount of and the availability of placements for children, right? There just aren't enough placements. It's hard to find a place. I know when we were looking for a place up in Carson City, it was very hard to find even a slot that was open because they were all filled. And so to be a family who's looking for that, long term and trying to balance all the other costs that we're seeing across the board is very difficult. And childcare itself is very expensive and can be very expensive. So I think that what we have done with some of those federal ARPA dollars in investing that in childcare and saying to facilities, we want to see you expand the number of placements. We're willing to help match some of that. We want to make sure that families are getting into places because that makes a difference between a family being able to go to work and pay their bills and provide for their kids and not being able to do that or making a decision that, we just can't afford childcare, so it's cheaper for one of the parents to not work. than it is to actually put their child in a place where the child can get care during the day. And then, eventually those children are going to go to school, and you have a household where someone's been out of the workforce for a hard time, and that brings about, employment issues that you have to try to solve as well. And so I think as a state, we have to continue to have that conversation. Certainly, I think the federal funds are a great starting point, but we have seen some legislation to help address that need. How are we supporting our child care workers? How are we providing, and can we continue to provide some additional subsidies to families who just can't afford that high amount for child care? I think that's something that we have to do.
So in your mind, would those subsidies, if they were state-based, would they go through the family or through the facility, or a little bit of both?
I think you've seen both, and I think that both are very valid ways of helping to address that need. Because like I said, it's not just what can the family actually pay for, but whether or not the facilities can employ enough folks, whether or not they can have a big enough facility so they can take in more kids, so that those placements actually exist. You have to address both of those aspects, right? We have to be able to have facilities that can employ enough folks to be able to take on those children. And so I think there's value in subsidies that we've seen go to some of those facilities, and they've been put to really great use. And I think some of the other things we ignore about on the facility side is things like, okay, your child is now at daycare, so what sort of access to toys and to learning materials do they have? What sort of safety, precautions are they able to build in the facility so that the children can't just walk out of a door? What about things like sinks and toilets and diaper changing stations and all of these little pieces that the facilities also have to provide? So subsidies to those facilities to help encourage additional placements, I think, is very helpful. In addition to saying to families who are looking at, how much per week are they going to pay? How can we help to support that? I think both are part of the conversation.
Okay, so Republicans, everything she just named is probably not a small amount of money if we were to do it statewide, because we lots of families with children in Nevada. Would the two of you be willing to consider state funding for subsidies to these facilities, as the senator just suggested? Because it's not going to be a small price tag.
I think childcare is fundamental to households, and we need to make sure that we have the supply side, right? Advancing the supply side, and also that we have quality childcare for our families. So I think it's something we should look at, and I don't know what it's going to add up to, but I know a lot of families are struggling with inflation and housing costs again, and childcare is something they have to be able to work. So I'm open to that conversation because we need to really make sure our families are safe and secure. And I appreciated the point you made around learning materials and other things that will help a child, not just placing them somewhere, but what type of environment. Is that a quality environment where a child can grow and be supported?
Okay, so I hate to do this because I would like to talk about this a little bit longer, but we need to move on to economic development. So kind of coming back to what you were maybe about to start talking about. So there's been this conversation in Nevada for at least since Governor Sandoval about tax abatements, to bring economic development into the state. Is it a good idea? Is it not? Usually, I've heard the word nuance, by the way, mentioned a lot on the stage tonight. I hope John Ralston is appreciative of that, because he's always looking for people to have nuanced conversations. Should the legislature have more power over how tax abatements are approved? I mean, right now, the Governor's Office of Economic Development basically has a blueprint that they work from, and if you meet certain standards, then you're going to get certain abatements, and we all know how it works. Should the legislature be more involved because it is such a crucial topic to our state, or is everything working just fine the way it is? And I'll go to you first, Assemblyman.
Nothing's ever working perfectly. That's why we're here every 2
I didn't say
years.
perfectly, I said fine.
Okay, fine. Actually, it originated with the legislature, and we gave it down to GOAID to assign those, because we're only here for 120 days every 2 years. And I don't feel like being called back every 3 months to approve another tax abatement or whatever. I personally may not agree with tax abatements, although I voted for them. We voted for Allegiant Stadium. You look at the success of what Allegiant Stadium has delivered, not just to Clark County or Las Vegas, but to the state as a whole in taxes and the C taxes coming up, excuse me, to Washoe County that they can utilize. So there is some benefits. Look at what's happened. To me, the person that should really be involved in the abatements and those discussions are the local entities. Again, I always get back to the locals. It should be Story County sitting there with GoEd, talking about what they can and can't do and afford, what they need to address. It should be even Clark County, the large counties, should be sitting down and discussing on those. So to me, we've given it should go back. The people that should really be there are the ones that are directly involved with being the local authorities and the businesses and GoEd.
Speaker, how do you see it? Does anything need to change?
Can somebody agree with me?
No, I mean, look, I wish the world were such that every state would say, we are not going to give tax abatements.
Amen.
And we could compete on a level playing field, because I think Nevada has a lot to offer. That's not the world as it exists. And maybe like you, I love watching movies, and every time I get to the end of the movie, I want to know where that movie was made. Was it Georgia? Was it Vancouver? There's tax breaks, there's abatements that draw that business there. So if Nevada wants to be involved in trying to get that business, I don't know that we have any choice other than to offer tax abatements if we want that business. Now, as a legislature, I think we have to decide. We could say no more tax abatements tomorrow, but you have to realize what the implication of that is. And when we're talking about diversifying our economy, we are a gaming and a tourism state, and we do that very, very well. But I don't know how we compete without it. And I will agree with Assemblyman O'Neill emphatically that you do not want your state legislature having to come in and approve every single tax abatement package. I mean, we are by far the weakest branch of government in the state. The Constitution is set up that way. So if we're going to have tax abatements, I don't see any other way to do it than to really house it in the executive branch. Now, do I think the legislature needs some oversight? Should we get more time than the 3 days that exist right now for the public and legislators to see the contours of those tax abatements? Of course. No one can process information in 3 days, but that's the conundrum that we're in. We want to compete, but we have to do tax abatements to compete. So that's a non-answer to your question, other than to say I wish the world were different than it is, but we live in the real world, and I think we have to be aware of that.
I wish all lawmakers would be willing to admit when they give a non-answer. That was well done. Thank you.
Well, I guess just to jump into a concrete example on this, should the legislature take any action to draw the Oakland A's to Las Vegas? And I guess we'll start with the Senate Majority Leader.
I think that there's definitely going to be a conversation about that, and I think the Speaker has elucidated a lot of the key points there, right? We have to make a decision about what it is we do in any of those circumstances when we have, a place coming to us or a business coming to us or an industry coming to us and saying, hey, we want to come to Nevada. Maybe there are some things that you can offer. I don't know exactly what that may or may not look like, but that's what we're here to do, right? Is to have that conversation and to make sure that as stewards of the taxpayer dollars, that we're doing that in a very responsible way, in a way that makes sense, and in a way that delivers, economic development to the state, and that delivers jobs to Nevadans, and that benefits the community. And I think those are the kind of things that we as a legislative body have the ability and the authority and the oversight for, and those are the kinds of conversations that we have to have. So I don't know if there's a final decision on that, but I definitely think that that's exactly what, you'll hear all of us talked about when and if we have something to discuss.
Okay, so Speaker, I've heard tell on the front page of my news organization that there are lobbyists working for the Oakland A's at the legislature. I'm sure you've spoken with some of them by now. The governor said no to tax subsidies for a stadium. So what is it that they want? What can you tell us?
Oh, I don't know that. I don't know what they want, but I will say I'm going to agree with Governor Lombardo. No raising of taxes to bring a baseball stadium to Las Vegas. Yeah, sure, they have lobbyists. Everyone has lobbyists. I don't know if you've been in the building. There's hundreds of
a
lobbyists.
time or two.
50-to-1 ratio lobbyists to legislators. But I don't think we're at a point where there's a definite idea out there. And like my Senate colleague, you have to be rational about this, right? I think the potential of bringing Major League Baseball to Las Vegas is amazing. I can't imagine having a stadium and a professional team there. But we'd have to look at whether that would make sense long-term for the state, and I just don't know what those contours would be at the moment. But I suspect the lobbyists will do what they do, and they'll come up with something and present it, and we as electeds will have to do what we think is right for our constituents and for the state.
Okay, I'm going to stay with you, Speaker, and I'm going to switch. Actually, no, I'm going to go to Senator. Yes, I'm going to go to Senator Canizaro. I really want a yes or no answer to this, if you can muster it. Will
cross-examination question.
Will Nevada be the next state to extend Medicaid to undocumented immigrants?
I don't know that I have a yes or no answer to that question.
Would you like it
so
to be?
There you go, a politician that has a non-answer to the question. I think that it is a very real conversation to have because we know that folks who show up to an emergency room with an acute issue who have no medical insurance coverage, no health insurance coverage, costs the state, they cost our hospitals a lot of money. And we, I think, have taken a lot of actions, and I've been sort of front and center in some of those discussions on how it is that we can increase coverage for Nevadans, because that is a more efficient way to not only deliver healthcare services, but also to deliver it in a way that manages our, an ER, someone who's presenting to the ER with something that is very serious, and that if it had been addressed earlier but wasn't addressed because they weren't covered, that's a cost to the state that we ultimately pay as taxpayers, right, in uncompensated for care. And so how do we address that problem, I think, is the big question that we're all trying to answer. And when it comes to Medicaid coverage, there are a lot of bills out there that are talking about how do we expand some of that Medicaid coverage, because we know that there are populations out there that are still being serviced by our hospitals, or still being serviced by our physicians, and they're just costing the state a lot of money. And so I think we're going to have very robust Medicaid conversations and kind of go from there.
Senator Severs-Gansert, I'm sure you know that the opposing argument to extending Medicaid to undocumented immigrants is that we're not doing right by U.S. citizens when it comes to health care. We should be doing more. We should be expanding perhaps Medicaid, Medicare. The state should probably be doing more. So that the argument is not that necessarily it's a bad idea, but that it shouldn't come first, right? There should be other things that come first. How do you see it?
So when you look at what we spend on healthcare, I mean, first of all, I think we all agree we want to make sure people have access to healthcare, and that's a pipeline issue, and we definitely need to work on the pipeline. When you look at the Medicaid rolls right now, we have about 900,000 people who have Medicaid, and it's very expensive. So we have to decide whether we want to invest maybe in clinics, because we have sliding scales clinics. We have federally qualified health centers. We have different types of clinics and entities that can help serve people, whether they're insured or not insured. But I think we have to be careful what we bite off as a state, what we can afford to do. And of course, we need to prioritize the Nevadans we have. And we already have 900,000 people on Medicaid. So we want to make sure people have access to care. But we have to be very careful about expanding anything, because we need to be able to afford it. And we also need to make sure we have alternatives so that people can have that access. And if you want to talk about pipelines, I have ideas on healthcare pipelines too.
Okay. We don't have time right now.
I could add it.
No, I don't want to talk about it.
The speaker does not want to talk about
The
it.
supply side, right?
The speaker has spoken. Let's move to environment, in particular water, which is just on everyone's mind across the Southwest United States right now. We all know what's going on in the Colorado River, so I don't think I have to set this one up. I'm going to let you ask this question, but I want to just remind everyone that last session what the legislature did was eliminate decorative turf down south as a first step in conservation. And so now...
Right, and I guess looking at the water shortage in Southern Nevada, right, we've seen Southern Nevada water regulators become sort of thought leaders. When we're talking about the Colorado River, we've seen the governor take an active stance and say that he wants to be more involved when we talk about how to save water down in Southern Nevada. So I guess, what's the legislature's role when we talk about the water shortage in Southern Nevada? What should the legislature be doing? And I guess we'll kick that to the Southern Nevada legislature, the speaker.
Yeah.
Can I put a point on that question? Sure. Do you mind? So California already for a while has been requiring private citizens in their homes to use less water. Is it time to do that for Clark County?
Well, first, let me give a shout out to Daniel Rothberg at The Independent. I don't know that anyone understands water better in this state. And so if you haven't read his writing, read it, because it is fantastic. But all great questions. I also want to be thankful for all the water we're getting up here. It's kind of a pain for the legislature. We desperately need it for the state. But no, you ask very serious questions, and I think, we're already seeing that in Southern Nevada with the Southern Nevada Water Authority. They're looking at the highest users, because when you look at the highest users, it's a very small percentage of people that use an extraordinary amount of water. I'm talking consumers, not businesses. So that's got to be a part of the conversation. The legislature did the decorative turf. We've got some bills this session about septic tanks, which use an incredible amount of water. But the truth is, without an influx of water into Southern Nevada, these things are small steps, right? I think, we are going to have a reckoning at some point. There's going to have to be a renegotiation of the Colorado River Compact. That's not something we can do as a legislature, but it's something that the federal government can do, and we have to bring Mexico in because we are the leader in conservation. And frankly, I'm tired of seeing states around us that aren't following that lead. We've done things to protect ourselves, but we have to get buy-in from the other states, or we could just hope, as Assemblyman O'Neill says, that we're going to have a super rainy season down in Las Vegas. But I think beyond that, we have to look at the real issue of what do you do when too much water is appropriated and there's not enough water in the basin. There's a large body of common law that tells us how to approach that, and we have a lot of people coming to us saying you should change that as a legislature, and those are really hard conversations we have to have. And so I don't have any great hope out there other than we've got to conserve, and I think we have to continue to look at desalinization efforts and invest where it makes sense. We have one with Southern California where we take some of their allotment. Those are things that will protect us long term, but the bottom line is we've got to step up and do better.
Does anyone have any, so I'm really looking for specifics here. So if there's something specific that you're willing to commit to, I would like to hear it. If not, we can move on.
Getting rid of septic tanks.
Ah,
Retrofitting.
okay, let's move on then yep, let's wrap. Okay, so we're just about done. We've got we call it.
One more question.
Yes.
One last one. Well, and this one is specific to the process and the logistics of the legislature this session, because we saw that the first deadline day was moved, right, for the bill introductions for individual legislators. And certainly that happened in 2021, but that was because of COVID. This year, right, we're still seeing sort of staffing issues impact the bill drafting process. So at this point, what's one process-oriented change that the legislature should make to make it function better, frankly, to for lack of a better word, we'll say. And we'll start with we'll say the majority leader.
I think first and foremost, we had to move the deadlines. I think you're seeing the same issues, right? That staffing and being able to recruit folks and being able to retain them across the state. And I know Assemblyman O'Neill touched on this. We all sit on the Finance and Ways and Means committees. That's an issue that is not unique to just state agencies, right? It also impacts the legislature. And so to the extent that we can continue to support and provide efforts to recruit and retain very talented individuals, and if you ever had a chance to work with anybody in the Legislative Council Bureau, be they in research, fiscal, or in legal, or on our day-to-day basis in some of the other departments, they truly are very talented. I don't know how we recruit so many great people to work in the legislative building in such a sort of, I guess, concentrated place, right? There's so many of them that have such great skills, and I have always been impressed with all of them. But to do that, you have to be able to give them a way to provide for their families, right? And so I think that's something that we are sort of investigating across the state. How do you help to support some of our state workers so we can continue to provide services to Nevadans? I will say this on the deadline piece. We put these deadlines in place so we can make sure that we're having, the 120 days move efficiently. But I am not worried about having to move a deadline to introduce a few more bills that are just taking a little bit more time to figure out details and to make sure that we get it right, and to make sure that we are having a thoughtful process when it comes to bill drafting and putting that all together and working with legislators on that. So I don't think that that's something that impacts our ability to work within the 120-day confines. But the one thing that I will say in terms of the legislature is just a huge shout out to our staff who work so hard during the legislative session. And frankly, in a lot of state agencies as well. But in particular, we get to work with them. So I would say that is a good investment for us. And from the legislative side, I hope that we can continue to do that so we can continue to have that very high quality talent working for us.
Speaker, you've been around the legislative block a few times. What one process thing could be improved in your mind?
I want to say I saw one of our bill drafters coming into the building at 6 p.m. on Friday, and he had a giant iced coffee from Dutch Brothers. And I said, iced coffee at 6 p.m.? And he said, this isn't going to be the last one I have tonight. So, we saw the impact of 3 snow days. That really hurt us. A couple of things. One, we can do better, because a lot of us have ideas and we put in bill draft requests, and then we sit around for a very long time before we tell the drafters exactly what we want, and they can't start drafting until we give them information. I think it's kind of human nature. You see a deadline, you tend to wait. We could all do a better job of doing that. And this is another suggestion that is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but keep in mind that every legislator who's elected gets to request bills, and they must be drafted. Doesn't matter what they are, how complicated they are, and what chance they have of passing. So if you wanted to run everything through the Speaker's office, the Majority Leader's office, and nix those before they get drafted, we could have had all the bills out weeks ago. Tongue-in-cheek, I'm kidding.
I don't think he's completely kidding.
No, you're
Assemblyman O'Neill, give us one process change that you'd like to see.
Maybe we could reduce the number of bills allotted to us.
Okay,
I-
to each lawmaker, you mean?
Yeah, I often wonder, why does the Senate get twice as many?
They are twice as important.
No, they're not. They just think they are.
She-
Yeah, twice the number of constituents. And there's that, freshmen don't get as many. Maybe we should look at reducing the number of bills. We have 120 days, it's set in the Constitution. If we had the magic wand, getting back to that perfect world that you discussed, Speaker, take a break after the bill. We take a week off from hearings and stuff and just let the LCB legal do their drafting work and not keep putting new pressures on them. Because new bills, we already have bills, and we're putting pressures on them while they're trying to write a bill. Well, I need an amendment to this bill before I present. Take that week where there's just let them do their work with nothing else being discussed. And, actually the snow days, I think, helped. I got a chance to sit down and read bills a lot to actually read instead of speed read them and review things.
Okay, so Assemblyman O'Neill wants more snow days, for the record.
I want more snow.
Snow days in Southern Nevada. We have some snow down there.
Senator Gansert, one thing.
Sure. So we have something called pre-filed bills. We have to get the information early. They have to introduce them right away. And at the beginning of session, you'll see that there's 150 bills that get immediately referred to committees. I think we should pre-file more bills, and we could expedite the process. It was mentioned that a lot of times legislators don't put their information in early enough. If you have to pre-file them, you have to provide the information and they get done. So I think the pre-filing system makes a lot of sense. And I would agree with Assemblyman O'Neill that we could also reduce the number of bill drafts.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
I'm going to take editor privilege here and add a closing question on top of the closing question. This is a yes or no question, please. I insist.
We don't do
And I am going to start with the Speaker.
Oh, no.
Should reporters be able to speak directly to lawmakers if those lawmakers are willing to do so without interference from the caucus or anyone else?
Yes, of course.
Senator? Yes. Assemblyman?
Yes, and we're doing it.
Senator Gansert? 100%. Okay. Thank you, and that's a wrap.